Hi, everyone. Good evening. Um, for those of you who are new to Moving Traditions, welcome to Raising Up Teens, our webinar series for parents and educators. For those of you who aren't new, thank you for coming back. We love you too. Um, Before we get started tonight, I wanted to just share a few words to frame what we're talking about. As members of the Jewish community, Jewish teens, like all people, need safety. They need physical safety and they need psychological safety. Part of psychological safety for Jewish teens in particular right now is being free from name calling or bullying. And we are acutely aware that tens of thousands of teens in North America right now are being singled out because they're Jewish or because they're guilty by association. The singling out of Israel for demonization has had a negative impact on many Jewish teens. And those teens need spaces where they can receive support and experience solidarity and community with other Jewish teens. But the other part of psychological safety is being free to learn. That means being free to ask questions, to explore complexity, asking questions about ethics, justice, ideology. Sometimes it even means challenging your teachers and parents to figure out who you are as a teen and what you want to believe. Moving Traditions has been working hard to create spaces for teens, spaces where it feels safe to be Jewish, and spaces where it feels safe to ask hard questions that might feel challenging or unwelcome in other Jewish spaces. Tonight, we're excited to explore some newer research from a beloved board member that we feel supports the approach we're taking to this work. In our work with teens and in what we learned from our network of over 300 institutional partners, we know that most Jewish teens are not extreme in their views to either the right or the left. Their ideas about politics are complex, savvy, and sometimes informed by sources that parents and educators aren't reading or even aware of. So our goal tonight is to dive deeper into that complexity, to understand how young people think about what has happened since October 7th, and to better understand how we, Jewish parents, funders, educators, everyone in this room right now should respond. And I'm excited that we have some of the best people tonight to do that deeper dive. We are joined by Brandeis professor Jonathan Krasner, chair of Jewish Education Research, whose new study helps us understand how today's teens and young adults are making sense of the post-October 7th world around them. You can all feel a little bit jealous that he's not just a brilliant academic, he's also a member of the Moving Traditions board, which means I get to talk to him whenever I want. But before we turn to him, we're going to be in dialogue tonight with two teens. So we want to start by meeting them now. Welcome, Jack and Gillian. Why don't you come join me? It's so good to see you both. Got to meet both of you, and it's a delight.
Happy
Jack,
to
I'm
be
going to
here.
ask. Yeah, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, where you live, where you go to school, and just one thing you like to do in your free time. We'll start with you, Jack, and then we'll move to Gillian.
Yeah, I'm Jack Levine. I'm 16. I know I like to play tennis. I'm a big tennis player. I'm number one in my high school. And so that takes up a lot of my time.
That's awesome, Jack. And Gillian, just give us one sentence about yourself, where you go to school, and what you like to do.
I'm Gillian. I'm 17 and I love theater.
Um, So we're going to ask you some really deep questions about how you're experiencing school and Israel and if you're experiencing anti-Semitism. But before we get to that later tonight, right now we just want to create a picture of, who you are and how you spend your time in the world. So just say a few words, starting with Jack again. What communities do you consider yourself a part of? What Jewish communities? What non-Jewish communities? What teams? Where are those communities that have an impact on where you feel safe, and what have shaped your opinions when it comes to anti-Semitism or Israel?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously at school, I'm part of like my friend groups, and obviously like there's a Jewish student union at school, so I'm in that from time to time. And then I don't know my tennis club and my tennis team at the high school, and then also my synagogue. I volunteer there on Wednesdays as a madrich, and then also BBYO, which is I don't know I haven't found the time this year to go as much, but last year I went to one of the big conventions and I went to some of the meetings, and yeah, I found that like that was a insight into other Jewish teams.
Perfect. And Gillian, where are you spending a lot of your time?
Um, well, definitely my theater club at school. I can't go a lot, but USY at my synagogue, called Koleinu, which is through moving traditions, and also it's I haven't been since 2024 since I'm a senior now, but definitely my summer camp.
So I think we're going to very shortly get deep into questions about how those different communities have presented safety or challenges as you've navigated the world post October 7th. But before we get there, I'm so excited to bring in Professor Krasner to ground us in the research. And then we'll come back to Jack and Gillian to hear how that research reflects in their experience. So, hi, Jonathan.
Hi, how are you, Shuli?
It's always good to see you. This feels very comfortable. I feel like I'm in this Zoom room with Jonathan quite often. But Jonathan, we're here sort of more formally and officially today. Start at the beginning. What made you decide to undertake this research?
Yeah, so I was, as you mentioned, I'm a professor at Brandeis,
Nice.
and I was teaching a course
Course.
in Israel education post October 7th, right after October 7th. And my students were really in crisis, and they were coming to me, and we were having deep conversations about what was going on, especially as the campus became more politicized, and the initial kind of shock of October 7th dissipated, and then the horror that many people felt about the war kind of took over. But still, there were a lot of people that were very upset about the hostages. So, I mean, it was just all of this stuff. And I started to wonder, okay, how representative is Brandeis relative to other schools? I mean, Brandeis is, I would say, pretty tame on the, spectrum in terms of activism. But I was interested in seeing like what was going on in other places. And so my colleagues and I put together a study where we looked at students who were attending colleges across the United States. We interviewed 38 students in, I believe, 17 different states, and we made sure to speak with a diverse population, people who were attending private schools, people who were attending large public universities. We were made sure that we got religious diversity and we got racial diversity and sexual diversity. So we really tried to get as much of a diverse population as possible. I should say, though, that for those who aren't initiated, one of the differences between quantitative studies, where you're looking at numbers, and qualitative studies, which is what I did, is you can really focus on the stories that people are telling you, and really get behind those numbers and try to understand why people are feeling the way they're feeling, what's really motivating them. So it was, I think, very rewarding in that way. But I don't make any claims that the numbers that we found in terms of how many people believe this or how many people believe that are necessarily like set in stone. We tried to get a diverse population, but like this wasn't, the Pew study or something like that.
That makes complete sense, Jonathan. And I'll put a plug now that the research is publicly available and it's for an academic study, like really easily readable. It's so digestible. I was reading it again today, and it's full of stories, like Jonathan just said. And I'll just say every story you read, you're like, oh, I feel like I know that person. I recognize that person. So with that said, Jonathan, like take us into take us into the findings, what you heard. I know research can be dense, so if you want to show us any slides, just take us through some of the top line findings of that study.
Yeah, so as we were talking with these students, and I should say that sometimes the conversations that we were having, they spanned, an hour and a half or 2 hours long. People were very eager to speak with us. This was in 2024, so things were still a little bit more raw than they are now. I should say, sort of parenthetically, that we went back and spoke to some of those people again more recently. And if we want to later on, we can talk a little bit, or maybe during the Q&A, people can ask me how their attitudes have changed over time. We haven't published that yet. We're still analyzing it. But as we were looking at as we were looking at the data, as we were looking at what people were telling us, we were really able to sort them into six different categories. And I don't know if the slideshow is available.
I think it's coming.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Excellent. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we, as we started reading more and more of these transcripts, we noticed that there were these seven different criteria that people talked about, and basically how they felt about these different criteria. In other words, how engaged were they in what was going on their campuses around Israel? How active were they? Were they involved in protests? Were they involved in rallies or vigils or not? How connected did they feel to the Jewish community? How much knowledge did they have about Israel? How much concern for anti-Semitism and wellness were they expressing? A lot of the people that we spoke with were really very psychologically affected by what was going on. And so that was interesting. And then finally, what we called narrative continuity, which is really just a fancy way of saying, were they coming out of this kind of process in the same place where they were beforehand in terms of how they felt about Israel and how they felt about anti-Semitism, or had they changed in some way? Had October 7th changed? We often hear from Jewish leaders that October 7th was a watershed, that everything changed after October 7th. And I have to say, for some of the students, it's true that October 7th really was a turning point, and for others, not so much. For others, it really caused them to just double down on feelings and thoughts and commitments that they already have. So what we came up with was these six different categories of people. And I want to be really clear about why we, like what the value is of six. Like it's not so much six or five or seven, but the point is that I think so much of the way we talk about attitudes on college campuses and I think on high school campuses as well is either you're pro-Israel or you're anti-Israel. And what we found is no. Yes, there were people who were very pro-Israel and there were people who were very anti-Zionist, but there was a vast middle. And two categories just doesn't capture how people were expressing their feelings. And so we came up with these different categories, these six different categories: affirmed, aggrieved, retrenched, conflicted, disillusioned, and disengaged. I'll just show you very, very quickly because I know we want to talk with the actual students and sort of get into it. But basically, the affirmed are the people who we would think of as the kind of classic pro-Israel people. These are people for whom October 7th really did energize them to become more involved in Jewish life. They were more engaged. They doubled down, really. And in fact, many of them made new friends and, sort of had new meaning in their lives after October 7th. For some of them, that meant, kind of being full-time engaged in defending the Jewish community. For others, it was just a way to kind of recall like what they loved about Israel, what they cared about Israel. Now that Israel was under fire, you can't take Israel for granted anymore. Now the second category is, so here is the classic sort of anti-Zionists. We call them aggrieved. They tend to be very active. They tend to be fairly knowledgeable, and they're alienated. And a lot of them are alienated, or they tell us that they're alienated because they feel like they were sold a bill of goods about Israel. They feel like the Jewish community, Jewish schools, etc., didn't level with them about the complexity of Israel. I really like the last quote. I mean, I don't like it like that it's happening, but I think that it's really demonstrative. This third quote here: I felt connected to Israel, but that connection became fraught, especially since I learned what Israel does in high school. We had an Israel-Palestine unit because I went to a high school in California. In eighth grade Hebrew school, we had a unit called Problems with Israel, but they talked about homophobia and racism and sexism, but they kind of ignored that huge elephant in the room. So it's not that people were encountering, quote unquote, the real Israel in their religious schools, but it was still a very curated real Israel. And they felt like after October 7th and the world around them and, social media, we'll talk about that a little bit. They really felt like everything that they were hearing, that they were listening to, made things seem a lot more complicated than than what they saw before. The other thing that I'll quickly say about the aggrieved is that a lot of them found community in this anti-Zionism. Many of them felt no longer welcome in Hillel or Chabad or places like that. And so the anti-Zionist activism became their Jewish connection in a way. Now that might seem to be a little problematic for some people, but that is honestly sort of how they saw it. They were making Jewish meaning, and they felt that they were acting out of their Jewish values, retrenched. These people are people who are primarily motivated by a concern about anti-Semitism, and they were very emotionally shaken up. They may have been pro-Israel, but they acted very differently than the first group, because the first group were kind of out and proud, and they were kind of their attitude was, we are Jewish, and we're going to, make it very clear who we are and what we care about. The retrenched people were the people who took off their Jewish stars, the people who tried to go under the radar. If you look at some of these quotes here, you'll see, I didn't wear my Jewish star necklace to school because I didn't want people to stare and think poorly of me as a person for being pro-Israel. Or I was the first quote. It was like the Jewish community just came together very strongly. But the flip side is that it was also very isolating. I was really only talking to Jewish people for a month after October 7th and even after that. So for these people, October 7th was an opportunity to really cocoon and to kind of go inward. And it was supportive, but a lot of them felt really isolated as well. Conflicted. Half of our students were conflicted. These are people who tend to be less active in Jewish life on campus. They're engaged in this particular in Israel, and what was going on in Israel. It was very hard not to be engaged, at least on some level, about what was going on in Israel. It was kind of all around you, but they really felt kind of disconnected from the campus community. And one of the things that really stood out about this group is that they were looking for complexity, and they weren't finding it in either the kind of pro-Zionist camp or the anti-Zionist camp. It was sort of like, a plague on both your houses. Like, I don't feel comfortable. If you look at the second quote here, what's tricky for me is I don't want to be in either of those spaces. I exist in a sort of gray area. A lot of our students felt like people weren't giving them they weren't giving them the credit for being able to think in a complex way about this issue. And it wasn't just rah rah Israel, and it wasn't just Israel can do no good. Like it was more complicated, and they just weren't hearing anybody in the Jewish community talking that way, or at least people in authority talking that way. And so they felt adrift. And the fact that they weren't as connected to begin with, I think really just magnified that. The next slide, we're almost at the end here, the disillusioned. Now, on one level, you might say, oh, these disillusioned people, they sound a lot like the conflicted people. They're allergic to labels. The one difference between this group and the other group, though, I think the salient difference is these are people who actually felt very connected to Israel. These are people who have visited Israel multiple times. These are people who are involved in the Jewish community. And these are people who felt brokenhearted by what was going on in Israel with the war going on and on and on. The ongoing sort of story of the hostages. And they were really struggling with moral and ethical implications of what was going on, and they were anguished. They still loved Israel. In fact, one of them told us that they still listen to Israeli music. They're still very engaged in Israeli culture, but it's almost like like the wool gets pulled out from under your eye, from over your eyes, and you see something for how it really is, and it's much more complicated and not as nice as what you thought. And people are very, very upset about that. And then finally, the last group are the disengaged. And these are the people who tend to be low information, low engagement, what's interesting about these people is that they actively kind of avoided Israel-Palestine whenever they could. They saw a protest, they actually walked in the other direction. They did not want to engage, they did not want to be part of this. One of them told me, I went to college so that I could make friends and, I could like do activities and I could broaden my horizons. And I'm not going to let this issue kind of hijacked my college experience. And what's also really, really interesting about these people, this group, is that they were actually more emotionally secure than a lot of other people that we spoke with. I think in part because they had a defense mechanism. They just weren't going to get that involved. And when they did find out more about Israel, their attitude was, "There's not much I can do about it anyway. So I'm not really sure like what I'm supposed to be doing here." So they also felt really uh, they felt really annoyed with people who were asking them as American Jews to be representatives for what was going on in Israel. They felt like what goes on there really has nothing to do with what goes on here. In my life, wherever I am, Bibi isn't asking me how I feel about this. Like, why are people expecting me to be ambassadors for the state of Israel? Like, so that's the kind of the group. I'm going to stop over there because we've been talking. There are other findings, but I'm not going to get into them right now unless we want to get into them. But I think, again, what I want to double down on is this idea that of complexity, that people are not either or, but rather that they fall along the spectrum. And roughly half of the people that we spoke with were not either pro-Israel in the conventional sense or anti-Israel in the conventional sense. They fell into those four middle categories: the retrenched, the conflicted, the disillusioned, the disengaged. It was really only it might have been even a little bit more than half fell into that middle category.
So, I mean, there's a lot that resonates with me from this research. First of all, whenever I see those quotes, they all read as so authentic and true, and you can hear them coming from the voices of the college students, and I love how real they make their stories. Um, but the other thing I love about this research is I live in a world talking to a lot of institutional Jewish organizations and educators and leaders, and so much of the conversation uses a lot of binary language about teens or adults who are Zionist or anti-Zionist, pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. And I love how you create all these different axes that create a much more complex constellation of what it looks like to be a young person today. Now, you're a very good academic, which means often when I ask you about your research, you always tell me it's descriptive. It describes what's going on in the world. It's not always prescriptive. It's not necessarily telling us what do we do about it. But as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about what these young people need, what would you tell educators to do differently as they discuss difficult conversations about Israel and Israel-Palestine
Right.
and anti-Semitism?
So the first thing I want to say, Shuli, is for the people who might be watching who are saying, okay, this stuff about college students is really interesting, but what does it have to do with my high schooler? I want to say, first of all, a lot of the people that we spoke with talked about their high school experience. Their high school experience was really formative. It wasn't like they got to college, and they suddenly became different people. So I think it's very relevant what's going on in high school. And in fact, I have been in touch, as you said. Involved at the Mandel Foundation for Studies in Jewish Education. So I kind of have my ear to the ground about what's going on. And in some respects, especially some of the elite private schools, the anti-Israel, anti-Semitism stuff going on those campuses are just as intense as what's going on some of these college campuses. So I think that's an issue. And I think also,
So just pause there for
yeah,
a minute, Jonathan, just to go into that, just to spend one more minute with that, which is like what I'm hearing from you is like this was clearly a study of college students and moving traditions, and many of the people on this call are thinking about teens. But you would say there's sort of a lot of analogies, a lot of equivalencies you can draw across this data. Would you add anything to
absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Absolutely, in two respects. One respect is that high school is formative for what happens in college, and people often spoke about what happened in high school as having an effect on how they were or how they felt or how they acted in college. And so that was one issue, and then the other issue is just I think that there's kind of a bit of a continuum between some of the uh, just some of the environment issues in colleges. I mean, obviously, most colleges are much larger than high schools, but high school is kind of like in microcosm, to a large extent. The same sort of issues are coming up for, I think, a lot of students, and especially in high schools that tend to be quite politicized, politically active, and for those people who were paying attention, to the news, that there were a number of very high profile issues with schools, in both on the East Coast and the West Coast. I mean, maybe less so in the heartland, where there were communities basically torn apart. I'm talking about high schools now, communities that were torn apart between various constituencies who felt like things were not safe, or that things had become too politicized. One of the quotes that I read to you also, the one from California, I think it's important to recognize that at least some states do have mandated ethnic studies requirements, and they're learning about Israel-Palestine from, I guess, a non-Jewish perspective. And so it's another reason, I think personally, if we're going to advocate a little bit here, it's another reason why I don't think that religious schools can just, or day schools can just pretend that this issue doesn't exist, and just, sort of serve falafel and talk about Startup Nation and everything's going to be okay.
So to dig in a little bit there, and this is moving traditions. Obviously, we released a Jewish identity in Israel curriculum recently, which I think does a lot of what you're saying. Really tries to explore what it means to build a loving relationship with Israel and understand what the history of Zionism and what it means to have a Jewish homeland, but also really delves into the Palestinian narrative because there is an understanding that um, we don't do we don't serve our teens by hiding this information from them. We insulate them for the short term, and then as soon as we send them out into the world, they're going to encounter this information, and we see how it can cause. And I love this language you use of like narrative disruption. Like I have personally talked to teens who have said like I felt like I was lied to all my life, and I just wish people had been more honest with me as I was growing up, so I could make my own decisions about how I feel. So moving traditions, has a stake in this as to how we think this should be approached. But can you say a little bit more? There's a lot of educators, a lot of funders in the room with us right now. Like, what do you recommend coming out of this research that you think will serve the needs of teens today when it comes to Israel education?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of different kind of ways that we can approach this. I'll just mention a few, but it's by no means meant to kind of capture everything. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago this idea that people are going to learn, if we don't teach them, other people are going to teach them. I want to just double down on that for a second and say that with the access to social media and the internet, people are going to be learning, my colleague Siegel Zakai at Hebrew Union College talks about how there's this transition that goes on like in second or third grade, where you're going from learning to read to reading to learn. And once you learn how to read, and you're reading to learn, you can go on any website and you can learn for yourself. And you are learning for yourself. And you're not necessarily always savvy about the political point of view of what you're seeing. You don't know how reliable it is. But even if it is reliable, it is a situation where the gatekeepers are gone, to a large extent. And we can't really just continue pretending like it's 1985, and nobody knows what email is yet, right? So, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle here. So we've got to do something about that. The other thing that I think I often talk about, sort of non sequitur, but related to this, is that I think that we as a community need to be more cognizant of the difference between feeling unsafe and feeling uncomfortable. There are people who we spoke with who genuinely felt unsafe being Jewish on their college campuses. There were people who felt, and interestingly enough, it was even more so not on their college campuses, but just walking around, let's say, in New York City. I had a couple of people, we spoke with some people at Columbia and at NYU, and they said, actually, on my campus, I feel safe. But when I'm walking in Morningside Heights or when I'm walking, down in the village, and I have my Jewish star out, that's when maybe I'm feeling a little bit less safe. So I don't want to pretend that there aren't people who are feeling unsafe. But a lot of the students who I felt with were actually just feeling uncomfortable. And it's totally understandable why they're feeling uncomfortable. They have never had to justify who they are, what they believe in. American Jews, thank God, it's not like anti-Semitism has disappeared, but relatively speaking, up until, maybe 10 years ago, people were living, with a small but very manageable amount of anti-Semitism in their lives, and they were kind of able to put it in perspective. And then I would say that even before October 7th, with really since 2016, and again, I'm not trying to get too political here, but definitely with the Unite the Right rally, and then the shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the environment has begun to change and it's become a lot more fraught. And American Jews are just not used to that level of friction. They're certainly not used to having to defend themselves or defend Israel on campuses. Their parents can't help them because most of their parents grew up, and went to college in the 90s or in the 80s when things were really kind of at a high point in terms of the welcoming that, the sense of welcoming that Jews felt on college campuses. And so I think that what's really required is that we teach resilience. Like that is what is required.
I
Yeah,
love it. Yeah, I love what you're saying, Jonathan. And I'll just lift up before we bring back the teens. I just want to lift up two things. One thing to sort of build on what you're saying, and then one thing, well, both are building on what you're saying. One is to say, like, I think we've been questioning sometimes this language of safe spaces for teens because really we are looking for stretch spaces for teens. Teens were places where they're pushed to learn and grow. But before they get to the panic zone where they get defensive or go into fight and flight, it feels too much. So I think I completely agree that this is about bringing teens into a stretch zone. And I think I'll say personally, with the hat of, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, there's a part of a lot of Jews who are that intergenerational trauma has made them see sort of all of the new manifestations of anti-Semitism as warning calls to something much bigger that could threaten our physical safeties. And we as Jews have sort of learned to hear those early warning signals, to react, maybe to overreact, or maybe just to catch it earlier this time. And I think that is the perennial debate we're having within the Jewish community. When should we toughen up and build resilience and just feel safe and strong in our Jewish identities? And when do we have to start getting a little bit more scared? And I think that's actually interesting to always talk about with teens for whom the legacy of the Holocaust is a little bit less present for them.
yeah.
So
And I think
yeah,
just to be
bring back
clear,
the teens moment, but I just want to hear you respond to that.
just to be clear, safety is like a bottom line. Like if there's no safety, then you can't have a constructive conversation. Whether it's high school or college, it's not going to be a productive learning environment if people aren't feeling safe. But that doesn't mean, as you said, that people can't feel stretched. And I totally agree with you that there is inherited trauma that is being implicated here in terms of the reactions. I'm not demonizing anybody, and I don't question people's intentions. I think that people's intentions are all good. But I do think at the same time that that we do have to think about the fact that we live in a pluralistic society, that not everybody is going to agree with us, that and that we don't do our teens or ourselves any favors by not giving them the tools that they need in order to navigate a world where they might be in the minority,
I love that. Yeah. So that's a perfect transition to bring back Jack and Gillian. to tell us a little bit more about what it feels like as a teen. So Jack, Gillian, we got to speak to you a little bit in preparation for this, and I'm going to actually start with Gillian this time. Tell us, you mentioned all of those different communities, theater and school and your camper mock crew and your like all the different communities you're part of. Can you talk a little bit about what they felt like as a Jewish teen over the last few years immediately after October 7th, and then whether that's changed after the ceasefire?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say like at school after October 7th, I didn't really know how to feel, how to react. I was like very shooken up and I was looking for, my friends to support me, but suddenly my school became very polarized and I live in a very Jewish area. Most of my friends are Jewish. A lot of people in my theater company are Jewish, so I've never felt in the minority in my school, but suddenly like people were starting to say like very anti-Israel stuff and to kind of make me uncomfortable. I started switching where I ate lunch just because I was hearing a lot of kind of upsetting conversations and suddenly it felt like I've nobody ever like directly made me uncomfortable or feel unwelcome, but I was starting to feel unwelcome in my non-Jewish spaces. I also had to mention before, but I'm also queer and I'm the president of my school's queer student like affinity group. And suddenly I wasn't feeling welcome in queer spaces because I'm Jewish. So I started turning to more Jewish spaces. I feel like October 7th, it made me want to feel more connected to Israel and more in touch with my Jewish community, which led me to be more involved in my synagogue. And in 2024, going back to camp the was kind of the only place where I felt truly affirmed and understood after going through like a really weird, confusing year.
Hmm, thanks for sharing that. And just say a couple of words about has it felt different since the ceasefire?
Yeah, I think it definitely has. Like, I think after the ceasefire, like a lot of people who weren't fully like invested and informed kind of stopped talking about it. I'd say like I still very much follow what's happening, but a lot of these friends who were like weren't fully educated or like they kind of stopped talking about it.
Jack, why don't you answer that same question a little bit about your school and home communities and what it's felt like as a Jewish teen over the last few years?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think definitely there's been changes. I think in my friend group, it's pretty split among Jews and non-Jews, and there's about 10 of us, and it's probably about 5 and 5. And I think that like immediately there wasn't tension, but definitely even some of the Jewish kids were making jokes about what was going on before it was like it was obviously terrible, but before like a lot of lines were crossed, it was I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. Like the before the situation kept getting worse, a lot of my friends were, I don't know, cracking jokes, and maybe it was a coping mechanism, but it was definitely uncomfortable. And I think that I don't know. At my synagogue, I'm not around a lot of um, teens, but when I am, it's definitely kind of avoided. I think, and especially at school, I don't know if I'm just not in those conversations, but I don't know. I haven't heard a lot of conversations about Israel and about what's going on. I've obviously found my way into some and had some tough discussions with people on both sides that are very polarized. But I would say that like personally, I would fall into that like disillusioned group, and then there's a lot of like just unengaged group. I mean, like a lot of kids are just kind of not talking about it, especially non-Jews. And I think that in my community, especially at school, it's mostly non-Jews. It's probably about like 10% of my high school, which is about like 2,000 kids are Jewish. And so it's not a very like outspoken topic. It's definitely talked about, and in my history classes, it's definitely related to because it's similar to other things that have happened in history. Um, but I don't know. I haven't felt super unsafe in communities that I felt safe before. But I definitely noticed a rift in how I express myself as a Jew.
Mm, yeah. Both of you wonderfully answered that question about talking to real people in real life, which we deeply appreciate. But we also know, as Jonathan mentioned, it's not 1985, and so much of a teen's life is happening online. Since October 7th, how has your online, social media feeds changed? And what do you think your friends are looking at that are affecting their worldviews? Jack, do
I
you want to
mean,
take that first? Yeah.
it, yeah, I'm if or if Gillian wants to go, either way. I think I actually want to amend what I said because the disengage is definitely more in person. I've definitely
Mhm.
seen a lot more kids post about how they feel, and I think that I was definitely one of those kids near the beginning of the war. And I think that a lot of people don't really fact check what they post, and I would think I was guilty of that as well, where I would kind of post things and really not sure like is this like super anti-Israel, is this super pro-Israel? But I don't know. I definitely had friends at school, I still do, who post super pro-Palestinian stuff, and I have friends all over the country that are in BBYO that post super pro-Israel stuff. So there's definitely a polarization, and people are not shy because they think that what they post on social media isn't like is a representation of how they feel, but that it can be like retracted and that it doesn't really like it's not like their real opinions. It's just like something that they can post. And I think that that gives the wrong idea because it does look like that's what they support. If someone posts that um, from the river to the sea, like free Palestine, that seems very anti-Israel. Whether or not they mean should there be a ceasefire in Gaza, should there like be aid for the for people in Gaza, like it's two very different things. And I think that a lot of social media feeds are very polarized, and that a lot of kids my age are seeing a lot of stuff that's one-sided, and then once they start seeing more stuff and liking more stuff, then it keeps going in that direction. It gets more polarized.
I just want to lift up, two different things you said. So one is we are also grateful for Jonathan's research showing us how complex and nuanced people's approaches to this conversation can be. And yet I love what you're saying, which is there's a vocal minority that's extremely loud, and they're part of what's giving us this impression of very strong, slightly more extreme views on the right and the left. So I think that's really interesting for you to note that in your feed. Um, and then the second thing was a question. Do you feel like have you ever sort of approached or like engaged with someone around something you saw they put online in a way that you felt was a productive way to talk to someone in real life after seeing something online?
Yeah, 100%. And I definitely, I don't know, especially, I've reached out to a couple of friends where I've said like, hey, do you want to like set up a call? Because they might not be in my area about like someone posted something that was super, I think it was like super pro-Israel in response to Mamdani being elected in New York. And I was like, hey, do you want to chat about this? Like, I would love to hear your point of view. And then I also had a friend who posts a lot of super anti-Israel stuff. And I had the opportunity to with one of my other friends who is he is Jewish, but he doesn't he never really embraced that side of him. He has like one parent and she is like sort of Jewish. And so he identifies as Jewish, but he doesn't really like he doesn't go to synagogue or anything. He didn't have a bar mitzvah. But having that conversation with those three people was super interesting, where it was two people that don't really post and one person that was super adamant on social media posting a lot of anti-Israel stuff. And so hearing his point of view is definitely super interesting. And I think it sparked a really meaningful, probably like 2.5 hour discussion that we just had like some random day after school. And it was super interesting.
It's I think you're rare, Jack, and sort of leaning into those conversations, but it's a really wonderful set of skills to bring to the table. So thank you for doing that. Gillian, can you talk a little bit about what you see online or what you think your friends are seeing online?
Yeah, so I think definitely social media makes it a lot easier to speak out because you're not face to face, and I think it can be a very useful tool. I think it can be helpful to like, be able to like say like what you can't say in person, but also a lot of misinformation was spread around, especially after October 7th. I saw my friends reposting like AI AI images from Gaza or just information that was confirmed to be false. And it felt like if I unfollowed a lot of people because I just didn't want to like look through story and story of really polarized views and posts. But if like and then I would have friends at school complain about the pro-Israel stuff other people were reposting. So like it very much felt like everything was polarized, and if you posted the wrong thing, you would be on like a cancel list or
Mhm.
something, basically. So that made it very hard, and this is a real life interaction, but at like a diner after a show, somebody asked me, like we were like joking around. But then somebody asked me, it was like supposed to be like a hot seat joke, but they asked me, would you burn the Torah or bomb a hospital? And that was right after I saw this person like repost something proven to be false about Israel bombing a hospital. So it felt very upsetting and very targeted because I know based on the media he was consuming, and he knew I was Jewish. He knew I supported Israel. So it very much it gives anti-Semitism, and also it gives anti-Semitism a megaphone, and
Yeah.
nobody's thoughts are really their own anymore.
And one of the things you're alluding to, Gillian, which we could spend an entire and may spend another webinar on, which is like this question of when is critique of Israel like sort of leaning into anti-Semitic tropes? When has it leaned into like truly, clearly anti-Semitic parodies and caricatures? And I remember you told me this story while we were preparing, and I was like, that has more than crossed the line. That is, sort of where we see these categories of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism very clearly bleed into one another. Um, I'm gonna bring Jonathan back, and while we bring Jonathan back, just Jack and Gillian, this is putting you on the spot a little. So whoever feels comfortable answering, Jack, I love. Jonathan just said, I think a lot of this research is also relevant to teens, and you already were applying some of the research to your friends groups and seeing the disillusioned and the disengaged kids there. Just Gillian or Jack, before we go back to Jonathan, is there anything else you heard from Jonathan's presentation that resonated with you that you saw either in yourself or in your friend group?
Yeah, I mean, Gillian, unless you want to say something, I could answer. The hiding of the star, I think I personally like have seen and have felt. I went to visit my sister who's at the University of Pittsburgh last year. And I think my necklace had actually broken, completely unrelated. I think I like the chain had just like somehow come undone. And so I actually didn't wear it. But my sister actually mentioned to me that because of the protests that were going on in Pittsburgh, this was either a year or two ago, I think it was last year, that she was actually going to tell me not to wear the star because she didn't think it was going to be that she didn't think it was unsafe, but she didn't want to risk it. Because there were I don't know, there were incidents at my high school or at the college and in Pittsburgh about like a very anti-Semitic acts, and so she didn't want to risk it. Like as her brother visiting her by myself in a different city, it was definitely like she just didn't want to risk it, and I think that was super interesting. And then I don't know, it's just there are definitely like polarizing views in my area where I definitely see people at my own synagogue that are and in the synagogues around where my synagogue seems to be very spread out, where there are definitely very nuanced views and there are definitely more polar views. And then in my community, there are definitely like a lot of different views. I mean, it's definitely there's some anti-Semitism that has been going on, and it's just I don't know, you can see the whole spectrum kind of like through Montclair.
Sense.
I
Gillian, is there anything?
Yeah, I definitely saw a lot of myself in the affirmed category. I think October 7th definitely made me want to be more in touch with my Jewish community, join more Jewish communities, and just be more vocal about Israel. But at the same time, I saw myself in the disillusioned category because I think my views were still very nuanced, and I had I felt conflicted a little bit. And also, as I mentioned, I was like, I felt like as a queer person, I was being driven away from two different communities because like a lot of queer people are anti-Zionist, and that was the impression of my community that my Jewish community was getting. But I definitely got now like I've definitely like in Koleinu I've done passion projects like find a solution to that, but I felt infirmed but also kind of like pushed out of my communities at the same time.
And we can cycle through a lot of these categories as we try to sort of, I mean, this is the act of being a teen, which is, not being stuck in one category, but taking the time to figure out how of all these, all the things you're learning and all of your life experiences are going to coalesce to form some beliefs, which honestly never stop changing, at least for me. Um, John, first I'm going to invite, if people want to put, we'll probably have a couple of minutes to take questions from the Q&A in the chat. So I'm going to invite people to put questions there now. We'll probably be able to take one or two of those. While people are writing those up, Jonathan, is there anything you want to respond to that you heard from the teens?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I completely agree that these categories, they're meant to be kind of distillations of a pure version of something, and that's not the way that people actually often live their lives. So I've spoken to many people. I've done some speaking since the study came out, and I had one person who told me, "Oh, I feel like I'm affirmed, on Monday, but then by Wednesday I'm feeling kind of disillusioned." And and I think that that's completely natural. I think people are just trying to figure out where they stand. And I think it's also really age appropriate, to go back to what both Jack and Gillian were saying. I mean, it's very age appropriate to be concerned about your peer group and to figure out like where you belong and what's important to you. And so I think that the natural kind of processes that a teen is going through, I think just magnifies some of the issues that come up in a situation like that. Um, and then I think one more thing I'll just say is that I totally resonate with what Gillian was saying about feeling caught, between her queer community and her Jewish community. I think that one of the things that really stood out from talking with these people, these students who I spoke with, was that up until October 7th, um, the kind of main galvanizing issues that people were sort of concerned about, like environmentalism or guns on, or Black Lives Matter, or sort of women in the workplace, and all of that, all of those issues. There tended to be a fair amount of uniformity in terms of how people who our teens and college students would interact with, would feel on those issues. And so it was very easy, in a sense, to just sort of blend in. You weren't really taking any chances. You weren't putting yourself on the line by going out, and marching for no guns in schools, or, for environmentalism. And this was really the first time where the community was torn apart. And
Mhm.
I think precisely because they weren't used to an issue that could potentially have different people thinking different ways. It was a very painful moment.
That makes complete sense. There's a question that came in through the chat that actually was one of the final questions I wanted to present. So thank you to anonymous attendee for setting us up for success here, which basically said that the study identifies 6 groups of experiences, but a lot of the time it seems like our Jewish institutions do the best job of catering to those who are on the margins, people who are either disengaged or really deeply pro-Israel. And so turning Jack, Gillian, and then Jonathan, let's do it in that order. Thinking about what you think teens need today from the people on this call. Remember, it's parents, it's educators, it's really important funders in the Jewish world. If you could make an ask in one sentence of what you think teens need today from this incredible ecosystem of support that's on the call with us, what would you ask of us? So, Jack, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I think to start off, just unbiased information. And I think that's super important, like just knowing where your information is coming from and how it's being presented, because you want the full story. And then I think that you need to let teens have their own opinions, that even though they may be your kids, that they might have different opinions than you and that we're different people. And that like we really should have the right to, like, even though we might have completely opposite views as our parents, that teens are coming into their own people and we're developing our own minds, and that we should have our own say in matters, and that even though we can't vote yet for high schoolers, that we will soon, and so we need to be able to be ready for that and make decisions on our own.
I love that, Jack. And that's so core to moving traditions to say teens have something valuable and nuanced to say, and we should listen to them throughout these conversations. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Gillian?
I think Jack put it really well, but like just listen to us. I think like no wherever you are, just like create an unbiased space where every teen like regardless of what we think or how we feel, like we can feel safe because like this sometimes like the scariest thing is just like talking to other teens about how we feel. So just supporting like individual beliefs is really important and just like making sure that like they have the support so we can speak up.
Love that, Jillian. And just to add, I think we are seeing in the chat a lot of people are saying if it's hard to share vulnerably with your friends, imagine how hard it is to share vulnerably on a webinar with dozens and dozens of strangers who are adults. So just Jillian, Jack, thank you so much for that bravery and for sharing so openly and candidly with us tonight. Jonathan, what's your piece of advice for everyone in the room?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Gillian and Jack uh, have a lot of wisdom to share there. I think that there does need to be, I think we as parents, I speak as a parent, we need to have more faith in our kids. And I think it's very easy to sort of kind of buy into a narrative that these poor benighted kids, they don't know anything and therefore they're being swept away. And at least my experience is that kids that I spoke with are much more sophisticated than that. For sure it would be good, as Jack said, if there was more reliable information out there. But I think that the kids that I spoke with are naturally skeptical. It almost seems like it's part of the kind of the water, you know what I mean? Given the ecosystem that we all live in with social media, I think that there is a certain kind of a skepticism that's sort of built in. I think the parents, again, well-meaning parents, should step off the ledge and not kind of blow things out of proportion. I know that's easy to say, but maybe now, 2 years later, there's a little time for some perspective taking. So that's definitely something that I do. But one thing that I really resonate in the question is just the resource allocation issue. I'm not in charge of, allocating resources of anybody, but I do think that, I mean, except like my own home, but I do think that we there is an overemphasis on the extremes and not on the people in the middle, and I think that we need to be more aware of how we can reach people who are thinking deeply, who are naturally skeptical, who feel conflicted, and how if at the same time, like we do want people, I think from an educator's perspective, I think probably a lot of Jewish educators want people to feel a bond and a connection with Israel. But I don't think it's either or. I don't think that the bond has to come with a complete and utter kind of Israel right or wrong, no matter what. I mean, I think that we can talk about the complexity of the conflict, and still at the same time foster a sense of connection. This isn't new advice. This advice has been out there for a long time, but it seems like every time there's a stress test, that advice goes out the window, and we man the barricades, and we have to make sure that everybody's feeling connected, and I totally get it. But at the end of the day, it's not going to really do any good.
I love that, Jonathan. And the only thing that's slightly different this time is now I have very specific research to cite when we tell people we really know that it's important to bring that nuance and that allow some complexity into that conversation. So I wish we had more time to talk to all three of you. I hope for the people who are on this call, these panelists gave you some sense of what's going through the minds of teens and young adults today and what they need from us, all of us on this call who are their network of support. And that's what Moving Traditions does. We try to help teens, their families, and educators navigate through the challenges of this ever-changing world. We're helping you navigate those challenges. We've done that for 20 years, reaching almost 50,000 teens over those 20 years with content that helps them use the wisdom of Jewish text and tradition to engage in deep conversations about who they are, who they want to be, and the world they want to build, which all requires us to really think about the complexity of this difficult world we live in. Over the last 4 years, Moving Traditions has been in exponential growth mode, doubling the number of teens we reached. There we go. Let's see. You can go to the next slide, Deborah. So as you can see, we've doubled from about 5,000 teens to nearly 13,000 teens in the last 4 short years. And we'd love for you to be a part of what we're doing. There's a few great ways to get more of this content. Deborah, you can go to the next slide. The first is we are hosting a webinar co-sponsored by the Jewish Education Project to support a social and emotional approach to Israel education, to give space for teens to talk about these complex ways they feel. Brian's going to helpfully put a link in the chat to that next event that you can check out to understand the Moving Traditions approach to these difficult conversations. And if you really say, I think I want to do this myself, and you work at a Jewish institution, we hope you'll check out our Jewish Identity in Israel curriculum, which really tries to give a lot of this information that teens are craving to teens to help them build that loving relationship with Israel, but also to give them the tools they need to, I'll quote our colleagues at Project Shema, to both hug and wrestle with Israel, which is, to me, the sign of a very healthy and loving and beautiful relationship. Other things you can do, I hope you will consider making a gift to Moving Traditions. On the next slide is a link to do that, to help us continue to reach more teens. I am tempted to say more about this slide just so we can stay on it longer so people can pull that QR code, but instead I'll ask Brian to put it in the link, because the last thing we want you to do when we're going to end on this slide is we want to keep getting better at giving you the right content. So please use your phone to download this evaluation to let us know what you thought about this, what you want to hear more about, how we can keep serving the needs of the Jewish community to engage teens the right way, the way they need to be taught and build community to keep becoming who they are. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for caring about our teens enough to be here. And we can't wait to see you at our next Raising Up Teen webinar. Happy Hanukkah.